So one of my patients was able to get his average blood sugar from 300 milligram per deciliter all the way up to 140 milligram per deciliter. He didn't do this by adopting a low-carb diet. He just kept the carbohydrate intake the same amount, but all he did is that he changed the type of carbohydrates that he was consuming, and thereby he was able to get his blood sugar back under control. In this video, I aim to share the same knowledge with you so that you can reap the same benefits. I'm Dr. Sri. I'm a board certified family medicine and sports medicine doctor. And in my clinical practice, I care for a lot of patients with diabetes, and I've helped numerous number of patients to come off their medications just by changing their lifestyle alone. Unfortunately, carbohydrates always takes the big blame because they have a direct impact on the blood glucose, whereas proteins and fats do not have a direct effect on the blood glucose. However, when you look at a 2017 systematic review and meta-analysis of prospective studies, they found an inverse relationship with carbohydrate consumption. Basically means that if one consumes more carbohydrates, there is a decreased risk for diabetes. However, the key is that not all carbohydrates are equal. So by the end of this video, you're going to understand what type of carbohydrates that you have to consume so that you can decrease the risk for diabetes. So let's say if you're suffering from pre-diabetes, then we can make sure that we can reverse your pre-diabetes. Or let's say if you're suffering from type 2 diabetes, this information is going to help you get your blood glucose back under control. Okay, so without further ado, let's get started. So now I'm going to talk about the basics of carbohydrates. Okay, I'm going to make it as simple as possible. So please make sure that you engage. Understanding this is very crucial. So carbohydrates are categorized into three main types: monosaccharides, oligosaccharides, and polysaccharides. So basically, when you think about monosaccharides, these are all single sugar molecules. So think about glucose, fructose, galactose. So these all single sugar molecules are some things that we don't consume on a regular basis. So for example, let us say one has got diabetes and I prescribe them a glucose tablet. So that's a pure form of glucose because that helps to quickly rise the blood sugar. But the next type of carbohydrates are basically the oligosaccharides. So you're combining two sugar molecules together to form a compound. So for example, table sugar. When you think about table sugar, which is sucrose, it is basically glucose plus fructose. When you think about high fructose corn syrup, although people blame high fructose corn syrup as the big problem, again, for me, in my opinion, sugar and high fructose corn syrup are basically the same. High fructose corn syrup has a little bit more of a fructose than glucose, but still kind of similar to sucrose or basically table sugar. When you think about lactose, so lactose is basically made up of glucose and galactose, and that's the sugar that usually found in milk. So finally, we have the polysaccharides. So when you think about polysaccharides, this is what we say as complex carbohydrates. So think about more like it's so complex that it's not easy to be digested, and thereby there's also a lot of fiber in it, which makes sure that the glucose, or let's say if it gets converted into fructose, it's not going to get released in the bloodstream quickly. So for example, grains contain starch such as amylose or amylopectin. They also have resistant starch, which we call it as fiber. The starch gets converted into glucose in our body. Similarly, fruits contain fiber, but they also contain fructose and glucose. Vegetables contain fiber as well as glucose and fructose, though not to the same level as fruits. And finally, we have the legumes that contain starch, but they have more amylose starch than the amylopectin. In addition to that, they also contain a lot of fiber. So amylose is digested more slowly compared to amylopectin. So which is why basmati rice have a slower absorption rate compared to jasmine rice because of the differences in the content of amylose and amylopectin. Basmati rice has a slightly higher amylose content than amylopectin. Similarly, legumes have a high amylose content, far better than basmati rice. So the way you cook starches also makes a difference. For example, let us say you're cooking pasta, and if you overcook a pasta, that digestibility is faster compared to when you cook at the right time. So let us say, for example, let's say if you overcook rice, but let's say you put that back into room temperature, or let's say you put it in the fridge and then eat it, the digestibility is going to be slower. So when you think about fiber, which is the resistant starch, they do not provide nutritive value, but they're essential in reducing your glucose spikes. It helps to nourish your gut bacteria. It helps indirectly with weight management and also supports healthy bowel movements. So far what we have seen is that when you take disaccharides, which is basically the table sugar and then the high fructose corn syrup, they get converted to glucose and fructose quickly. Whereas when you take your polysaccharides, which is basically the grains or the legumes, they contain a lot of fiber, and thereby even the starch gets broken down into glucose, it takes a lot of time here. So furthermore, table sugar lacks additional nutrients, whereas grains, vegetables, and fruits, they offer a range of vitamins, minerals, and antioxidants that are going to be beneficial for your health. While animal foods do offer a small amount of glycogen, a form of polysaccharide, plant foods obviously provide much more. Now let us assume that you've consumed glucose, or let's assume that starch has converted into glucose. So what happens in our body? So let us say the glucose comes into the bloodstream. So the glucose comes in the bloodstream, and then we need a properly functioning pancreas to provide the hormone insulin. And basically what the insulin does is that the insulin helps the glucose to get to the respective storage areas. And we have three types of storage areas. So one, we've got the muscle glycogen. The other one we call the liver glycogen. And then finally, we have the fat. So basically what the insulin does is that it puts the glucose on the muscle glycogen and then it puts in the liver glycogen. And then once you have excess glucose, then it gets stored as fat. And we have two types of fat stores in our body. We have the subcutaneous fat and the visceral fat. Now let's talk about fructose, okay? So let us assuming that I'm going to eat a fruit. So I'm going to eat an apple, okay? So now that contains fructose. The problem with the fructose is that the fructose is it doesn't go to the muscle glycogen directly. The fructose gets directed to the liver. So the fructose gets directed to the liver, and then the fructose gets converted into liver glycogen, and then the excess fructose goes into fat. So now one can always bring glucose from the liver and then use it, and then after that you can put it in the muscle glycogen, but you can see that this is not a direct process. It takes a long way for the glucose to enter in the muscle. So which is why when someone consumes excess fructose, once the liver storage is full, then immediately the rest of the fructose gets converted to fat. But however, if someone is physically active and they're not consuming a lot of fructose in their diet, usually it's not a big issue. The issue comes when you're pairing it with the physical inactivity, which is kind of the pandemic that we're facing right now, which is what is causing the increased risk for diabetes and prediabetes. And again, when the excess fructose gets converted to fat, they get deposited either in the subcutaneous fat or the visceral fat, and the same goes with the glucose too. But the key is that there are some people who may not have a lot of subcutaneous fat. In that case, they can develop diabetes at a low BMI, which is kind of one of the theory that we have why some people with low BMI still develop diabetes. And again, I've covered this in a separate video, and I'll link this video in the description box below. Now let us say I've added exercise into my lifestyle. So what the exercise does is that the exercise needs energy. So the energy is going to be derived from three places. So it's going to derive from muscle glycogen, liver glycogen, and fat. And again, in this video, I'm not going to go into extensive detail about exercise, and I've done an extensive video on how exercise helps with diabetes, and I'll link the video in the description box as well as in the end of this video. Okay. Now let us say if you're suffering from diabetes, any type of diabetes, type 1 diabetes, type 2 diabetes, or pre-diabetes, here are some actionable steps that you should consider right away in order to get your blood sugar under control. So the first step that you should consider is basically reducing your intake of disaccharides. So basically you have your table sugar high fructose corn syrup, which I would recommend you to completely eliminate it. And then let's say you consume a lot of dairy in your diet, then I'll recommend you to cut back down on that. Most of the time it goes hand in hand. Most people do not just consume just plain dairy, they're also consuming a lot of added sugar in the dairy, which kind of mix together and thereby causing the increased amount of sugar consumption in one's diet. So in the past, so when I was growing up, if somebody asked me, so usually I'll ask my patients what's your sugar consumption like? You know what the patients will tell me? They say they don't add any sugar. But the time that we're living right now is that we don't have to add sugar. Everything is already added. So it's important to make sure that we read the nutrition labels right now. So for example, when I was growing up, I could pretty much say okay, I added 4 teaspoons of sugar, or my mom would have made a treat from like a milk treat or something like that, and I know exactly how much sugar she would have added in that particular milk treat. But right now, where we consume a lot of foods from outside, a lot of processed foods like lots of breads, bagels, and things like that, there are a lot of added sugar in it that we should start to be aware of so that we can cut back those added sugars. For instance, a tablespoon of ketchup can contain 4 grams of added sugar. A serving of cornflakes might have 4 grams. A blueberry bagel, approximately 8 grams. And some types of bread can contain 3 to 4 grams per slice. It's crucial to become vigilant about reading nutrition labels to spot and avoid these hidden sugars. Additionally, eating fried foods with added sugar can exacerbate metabolic issues. Believe it or not, for most of my patients, just fixing this alone can change their metabolic health. Studies show that an average American consumes almost 64 grams of sugar per day. So that's why I emphasize you to start reading the nutrition labels so that you know exactly how much added sugar that you consume per day. So what should you focus then? Your focus should be predominantly on polysaccharides. So when we think about polysaccharides, think about grains, fruits, vegetables, legumes. So the focus should be to make sure that you consume minimally processed polysaccharides. So for example, fruits and vegetables are not going to be processed. So basically you're going to consume pretty much like, you're not processing it at all. However, fruits can be processed too. For example, like people come and ask me, okay, is it okay to consume a fruit juice? But technically, that's kind of some sort of a processing that has happened. And again, that's going to affect the digestibility of that particular polysaccharide. Same thing goes with grains, okay? So you can get a minimally processed grain, or you can get a heavily processed grain. And most of the time when you eat a heavily processed grain, it's going to be more flavorful and it's going to be more tastier. But at the same time, when those grains goes through a heavy processing, you're increasing the digestibility, so your blood glucose is going to increase fast. In addition to that, you're also going to lose a lot of fiber. You're going to lose a lot of nutrients that come along with that. Okay, let us take brown rice versus white rice as an example. So what the milling process does is that it removes the nutrient-rich outer bran and the germ layers, and this is where fiber, magnesium, potassium, iron, several B vitamins are found. So when you consume white rice, even though they are fortified with iron and certain B vitamins, it typically cannot match the nutritional profile of whole grain brown rice. Similarly, when you look at a difference between steel-cut oats and quick oats, although the nutritional content might seem similar, the processing is going to affect how they are going to be digested in your body and consequently your impact on your blood sugar. A good rule of thumb when you consider a ratio of carb versus fiber, I usually would say 1:5 to 1:10. More than that, you should start to become more cautious. So basically, when you are going to consume 5 grams of carbohydrate, you should have at least 1 gram of fiber. Or let us say when you consume 10 grams of carbohydrate, you should have at least 1 gram of fiber. So let me show you some examples of carbohydrate to fiber ratio of certain foods that we consume in our diets. So let's take an example of white potato. So they have 60 grams of carbohydrates and there are 4 grams of fiber, which equates to 1:15 ratio. Whereas when you look at sweet potatoes, they offer a better ratio of 1:6, so which is why you have to be cautious when you consume a lot of white potatoes. Now let's take a look at fruits. Most of the fruits do really well. So for example, even when you look at bananas, they have a decent ratio of 1:9. So let's move to grains. So brown rice has a ratio of 1:11. Pasta when cooked al dente is at 1:9. Whole wheat pita bread comes at 1:7. Popcorn and legumes also have a good carb to fiber ratio. So don't worry, I'm going to link the fiber chart in my description box below so that you can take a look at it and make informed decision when it comes to choosing the right carbohydrates. So the general fiber recommendation stands at about 38 grams per day for males and 25 grams per day for females. So this is a good benchmark to see if you're meeting your dietary needs. So make sure that you start to ask yourself whether you're meeting the necessary fiber requirements on your daily basis or not. If not, I would highly encourage you to work on that, because once you start to eat carbohydrates that are rich in fiber, that's going to change your health. So let us say this is how I have helped a lot of patients help reverse the diabetes, their pre-diabetes and so forth. But let us say if someone is suffering from severe insulin resistance, or they are suffering from type 1 diabetes or maturity onset diabetes of young, in that case, it's also important to make sure that they know about the glycemic index of the carbohydrates. So to know more about glycemic index, so make sure that you check out this video here. If you want to know how exercise can help with diabetes, then check out this video here, and I'll see you in my next video. Until then, goodbye.